Welcome to session 3 of block 1, the role of the Blue Shield and wider cultural property protection. And in session 3, I'm going to be talking about a brief history and an overview of cultural property protection, CPP, and just a couple of pointers towards the key legal framework and context of CPP. So in terms of the history, one of the huge questions is, of course, does cultural property have to be destroyed during conflict, or is it a good idea? And pretty much all of those experts who are military theorists or tacticians over about the last 2,500 years, from Sun Shao in 6th century BC China, Polybius, the Greek historian, talking about Roman excesses, Hugo Grotius, Karl von Clausewitz, and Francis Lieber there in the middle, all say, and there are others, but all say that it doesn't have to be destroyed during conflict. And more than that, with allowing cultural property to be damaged during conflict is bad military practice. And I'm just going to sketch over some of these ideas. So right back in the 6th century BC China, Sun Shao was saying that the critical thing of fighting battles and wars is that more battles will follow if you don't win the peace. So the critical thing is don't destroy everything of your enemies. And two quotes from his famous book, The Art of War: the general rule for the military is that it is better to keep a nation intact than to destroy it. So that's not only talking obviously about cultural property, but all property within a nation. And the supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. And the implication of that, and he expands on that a little bit, is that if you don't fight, you don't damage. If you don't damage, then that's the way to keep a peaceful society post-conflict. And the siege of a city is only done as a last resort. And of course, it was besieging cities that did most damage to cultural property in the warfare of this time. So Sun Shao is pretty adamant. And Li Quan, a Tang dynasty, so a few hundred years later, commentary on Sun Shao, Li Quan adds, and I quote, "When you enter deeply into enemy territory, you should not antagonize people by acting unjustly. When the founder of the great Han dynasty entered the homeland of the supplanted Qin dynasty, there was no rapine or pillage, and this is how he won the people's hearts." So the critical thing going way back 2,000 years plus is military strategists thinking not only of winning battles and the conflict, but winning the peace so that there doesn't have to be another war. Polybius, the Greek historian, writing about the looting of Syracuse by the Romans in 211 BC, argued that the looting was wrong. Taking gold and silver of rich people, that was okay, but taking cultural property, absolutely not okay. Removal of cultural property would lead to the resentment, the undermining of future role, and lead to rebellion. And so, echoing Sun Shao, even though my guess is he'd never read him, he argued, Polybius, this is, argued for restraint, only damaging places where necessary, and above all have respect for religious and therefore cultural places, and leave art where it was intended to be seen. So seeing that statues and the such should not be removed from where they'd been crafted to be placed. But Polybius's argument about only damaging places where necessary actually is a precedent of something that we'll come to later called military necessity. And there is a get out clause in much later legal areas around this term military necessity. It's in the 54 Convention, and we'll come back to it later, but it stems from at least Polybius. Interestingly, given some recent events, the covenant of the Prophet Muhammad with the monks of Mount Sinai demonstrates fundamental evidence of the respect for and protection of places of worship of other faiths. So the Prophet writes, no bishop is to be removed from his diocese, nor monk from his monkdom, nor ascetic from his cell, nor pilgrim from his pilgrimage. Neither is any of their assembling places or churches to be pulled down. Neither shall any of the wealth of their churches be employed for the building of mosques or houses for the Muslims. And whoever doth this shall have violated the charter of God and the charter of his prophet. So a clear direct link to early Islamic views on CPP. One of the first times that I've been able to found that it was actually written into military practice were the so-called 1385 Durham Ordinances, which were a code of discipline for the English army drawn up by Richard II in Durham just before moving into the invasion of Scotland in 1385. And Article 3 of the Durham Ordinances includes, and I quote, that no one should be so rash as to rob or pillage a church. And the penalty for anybody caught doing that from the English army was death. So a fairly clear statement about the protection of religious and therefore cultural heritage. The sort of jumping ahead a little bit, many of those who talk about these sorts of things identify the Treaty of Westphalia that ended the 30 Years' War in Europe in 1648 as the real introduction into international law of the protection of artifacts, in particular relating to the past. So Article 15 states, and I quote, that all the Lower Palatinate, with all and every of the ecclesiastical and secular lands, rights and appurtenances which the electors and the Prince Palatine enjoyed, shall be fully restored, and critically, as also all the documents, registers and papers belonging thereto. So a real early statement about documents, archives being returned to their rightful owners at the end of the hostilities. Going back into military practice, the most one of the earliest iterations of CPP in what we would now refer to as modern history is in the instructions for the Government of Armies of the United States in the field, issued in 1863 during the American Civil War. And Francis Lieber, the gentleman on the left of the screen, had been a Prussian officer at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815 and had moved to the US and was a military advisor to the federal government, the Union side, and he helped draw up these instructions. And Article 35 of these instructions identifies that classical works of art, libraries, scientific collections, or precious instruments, such as astronomical telescopes, as well as hospitals, must be secured against all avoidable injury, even when they are contained in a fortified place while besieged or bombarded. So there are 2 points to pick up there. Firstly, he goes back to Sun Shao almost in saying, even if they are contained in a fortified place which is bombarded. So again, that bombarding of towns or cities, which is where most of the damage is done, because still in the American Civil War in the 1860s, battles were fought outside towns mainly and were therefore not really there damaging cultural property usually. And also the link with must be secured against all avoidable injury. And that again goes back to this concept, although not clearly defined in this instance, but the concept of military necessity. So you must try to stop injuring classical works of art, etc. But there is the nuance there that says, unless it's necessary. And so that military necessity is there. Following the Liber Code, there came a whole succession of legal documents, which I'm not going to go into in this session, but just to flag to you the number of things. So following the 1863 Liber Code were the 1899 and 1907 Hague Conventions, which mention cultural property protection. There was the 1935 Rorett Pact, which is specifically about protecting cultural property, but was only signed by countries in the Americas. Then, of course, the 54 Convention, the 1977 additional protocols to the Geneva Conventions, the 1998 Rome Statute, which set up the International Criminal Court. There are various UN Security Council resolutions over the last 10 plus years, for example, 2347. And there is a current initiative to make access to cultural heritage an explicit human right. So following from the 1863 Liber Code, a whole list of attempts to embed cultural property protection into international law. And we'll come back to that in block 2 in much more detail. Moving the story on, we come to the First World War, which was absolutely unlike any previous war. There was an unprecedented use of lethal technology. The trench warfare that started, there was more destructive artillery. Air power was used for the first time in a war, and tanks deployed for the first time. And we've all seen horrific photographs and film footage, I'm sure, of the conditions in the First World War. But in this image, you see a British trench here, but behind it, an encampment here, but the remains of a village. And one of the buildings targeted early in the attack on this particular place was, as ever, the church and the church tower, because church towers were used as observation posts along the Western Front in the war, and hundreds of medieval churches destroyed and damaged in that fighting. Massive destruction of cultural property. But there were some good things in the First World War as well. And depending on your point of view, in 1917, the British either occupied, liberated, or conquered Jerusalem. But however you view that, there was very clearly a proclamation the day after the day that the commanding officer, Field Marshal Allenby, walked into Jerusalem, as in this image, in his attempt to show that it wasn't a conquering or a military alien occupation, but a liberation and a peaceful occupation. And in Allenby's proclamation, actually written by the civil service back in London, but every sacred building, monument, holy spot, shrine, traditional site of the three religions will be maintained and protected. And that proclamation went a massive way to disarming those people who might fight against the military occupation by the Brits. And as a result, not only was it in the proclamation, but troops were deployed to protect all of these sites. And here is the Mosque of Omar, now guarded, as the Northumberland Gazette said, now guarded by British soldiers of the Muslim faith from India. So somebody on Allenby's staff was thinking that extra step. All of his troops needed something to do, but by putting Muslim troops to protect the Islamic sites, they again took another step in disarming any potential opposition to the military occupation. As a result of the proclamation of the clever deployment of Muslim troops to protect Muslim sites and Christian troops to protect the Christian and Jewish sites, there was no opposition to the military occupation during the war of the British in Jerusalem. The opposition came after the war with the civilian government in, again, occupation. But very clever stability policing, as it would be called today. And of course, also very good propaganda, because again, back to the Northumberland Gazette, when the British set out to capture the Holy City, they took pains to safeguard all of the sacred buildings from damage, acting in strong contrast to the German bombardment of Reims Cathedral. So get the propaganda in there as well. In the Second World War, we've all heard, I'm sure, of the Monuments Men and of course women who were deployed, mainly conscripted civilian experts who worked to protect and recover cultural property across Europe and also in the Pacific and other areas of fighting. The Monuments Men were very successful in a limited way because there were very few of them, no more than about 350 in total across the whole of the conflict areas, and were essentially disbanded because they were all conscript civilians. When the last one was demobilized in 1947, they turned the lights out and shut the door behind them. There was very little contact between the military and cultural heritage experts over the next 40 plus years. There was some limited work in former Yugoslavia, and the US Civil Affairs had or retained a small capability, but it was very small and not central as had been during the Second World War, with the support of Field Marshal Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander for the Normandy invasion, and also for fighting in Italy, where he had sent a number of memos out saying that unless military necessity dictates, again back to that, cultural property should be protected. And Eisenhower, very supportive, and that's very important that senior military commanders are supportive of actions of CPP. And then we come to Iraq in 2003, and this is where I first became involved in all of this issue. In 2003, neither the US nor the UK, the two main leaders of the coalition to invade Iraq, had ratified the 54 Convention or its protocols. No coalition combat troops in the invasion force had orders to protect the museums or galleries or archives, libraries or archaeological sites. It appears, as far as we can see, that these places were not even marked on combat military maps. There was an extraordinary limited cultural property expertise within the coalition forces, a limited civil affairs capability in the US and a couple of European countries, particularly including the Netherlands. So very little identity that cultural property was important. So what went wrong in Iraq? Well, there were lots of things that went wrong in Iraq, and I'm not here to go through all of that. But firstly, there were simply not enough troops deployed. Secondly, there was a failure to comprehend the possible post-conflict scenarios in Iraq, and there was no understanding for the need of wide range of stability policing. The combat troops protected the Ministry of Oil, the Central Bank, the Ministry of Finance, but they thought everybody else could just get on with their daily lives, while at the same time disbanding the Ba'ath Party and disbanding the Iraqi military. So a complete failure to understand the possibility of the situation following the successful invasion. And then thirdly, in particular, a failure to understand the importance of cultural heritage and cultural and historical relationships. So to put the Brits into Basra was a step that would have only been taken by somebody who had not read the history of fighting in Iraq in the First World War and before and after with the British. A bad move that had serious implications as time went on. So those are the sort of overarching things that went wrong, but there were two other critical issues that also went wrong. Firstly, the decision by the humanitarian sector not to engage in CPP. And when I first got involved in this, I suggested that surely it would be the Red Cross who would take a lead on this. But the Red Cross responded at that point by saying that no, they protected civilians, non-combatants and POWs, etc., but they did not want to confuse the situation by also trying to look after cultural property. And secondly, there was a complete failure of the heritage sector to engage successfully with the military, and that had petered out following the Second World War. If we are to support the military, we have to help them with information and advice if we don't want them to damage material during the conflict. And so we come to Samarra in Iraq in 2006 and juxtapose that with Jerusalem in 1917. And all we can say is that that is perhaps less good cultural property protection, because the mosque in Samarra was one of the most important mosques for Shia Muslims, and the destruction of the Golden Dome is generally identified as the tipping point into the full-scale sectarian civil war that led to coalition troops having to stay in Iraq for an extra 5 years, taking 5 years worth of casualties and, of course, fatalities. It was an avoidable event. If anybody in the planning of that invasion had thought to read their history and had thought of reading Allenby's work, about Allenby's work, then they would have seen that the protection of critical sites like this would have paid dividends tenfold. It was an avoidable event had the coalition helped to protect that sacred site. I'm not saying the Civil War wouldn't have happened, but it wouldn't have been, it wouldn't have developed in the way that it did, and it wouldn't have come as a shock in the way that it did. So a complete failure to understand the situation of the fighting. And again, going way back to Sun Shao, his point is that you will only win a war if you understand the political context of the war. And here was a classic example of the failure to understand the political context. So at the moment, we have the 54 Hague Convention, and under the 54 Convention, protection of cultural property comprises two elements: safeguarding and respect. There are civilian peacetime responsibilities and military conflict time responsibilities, but also military peacetime responsibilities. And the peacetime responsibilities and activities that are envisaged in the 54 Convention enable the conflict responsibilities to be deployed. And the Convention rests on the laws of armed conflict, which of course governs how military forces act in conflict. And here you have the three various emblems of basic protection, special protection, and enhanced protection under the 54 Convention and Second Protocol. So just very briefly to talk about the laws of armed conflict, and again we'll look at this in slightly more detail in block 2. But the widespread adoption of the 1977 additional protocols broadened the laws of armed conflict a little bit. And there are some key concepts that the military have to take into account, not only in terms of CPP, but in terms of all of their activity. So firstly, necessity. They are only supposed to do what is necessary to achieve the mission, nothing else on the fringes. So necessity. Distinction, distinguish between military objectives and civilian targets, and civilian targets should be avoided at all cost wherever possible. Proportionality, any attack, any military activity must be proportionate to the expected advantage and critically cause the minimum collateral damage. This isn't to say that the military get this right all the time. Perhaps recent examples would say they get it right not much of the time, but these are things that they are supposed to take into account. And with my experience of the military, they certainly do try to take into account, but they need other people's help to help them. So they must act in good faith, and that's great. But if they don't know where cultural property is, for example, it becomes very difficult to protect cultural property. The only real way that they're going to know where cultural property is in an area they are deployed to is by being told that by the heritage sector. And the last one is feasibility. You can only do what is feasible in the circumstances at the time. You can't act with hindsight, and that's another critical element. But critically, it's the civil responsibility to excuse me, to expand the bounds of feasibility. For example, armed forces can't protect a site, as I've just said, that they didn't know it was there. So the knowledge and the importance of a site is linked to command decision authority, but you can only make those links if the heritage sector have informed the military about what cultural property there is there. We'll talk about command decision authority in more detail later in block 2, but just to pick up on the whole package of the Hague Convention and the second protocol in terms of protection, there are 3 levels of protection. Firstly, of great importance with the single blue shield, of special importance, very great importance, special protection, and enhanced protection of the greatest importance. And again, we'll talk about these in much more detail in the second block. But the point I want to make at the moment is that while national committees can obviously and should get involved in the identification of these sites to help the military in their own countries, regardless of whether there is the imminence of armed conflict or not, because we go back to the idea of preparation in peacetime. The point I want to make is that there is no protection under 54 for cultural property of local importance. And as one of my military colleagues constantly asks me, all of this is fine, but what I want to know is where can I park my tank in that village without causing offence? And again, that's where national committees can come in and help, and the heritage sector needs to come in and help the uniform sector to begin to identify these sorts of issues. It may not be that we can tell them what is important in every different village, but what we can give them is an indication of the things to look out for in all of those villages. So while we've got the regime of value and protection up here very firmly established in international law, down here there's an additional requirement for us to help the uniform sector from the heritage sector. If we go back to Resolution 2 of the 1954 Hague Convention Conference, there is some important and oft missed text. So the conference in Resolution 2 expresses the hope that each of the high contracting parties, in other words, each of the countries that ratifies the convention, should set up a national advisory committee consisting of a small number of distinguished persons, for example, senior officials of archaeological services, museums, etc., a representative of the military general staff, a representative of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, a specialist in international law, and 2 or 3 other members whose official duties or specialized knowledge are related to the fields covered by the convention. Okay, high-level distinguished group. One would hope that they are supported by others plan to do some of the work. The committee should become under the authority of the Minister of State or senior official responsible for the national service, chiefly concerned with the care of cultural property. So it's a cultural ministry responsibility, this, not a Ministry of Defence responsibility. But the chief functions of this committee would be A, to advise the government concerning the measures required for the implementation of the convention in its legislative, technical or military aspects, both in times of peace and during an armed conflict. And that again is a critical part, both in times of peace and during. In many ways, the Hague Convention is a peacetime convention because you can only be effective during an armed conflict if everything is in place during peacetime. Secondly, to approach its government in the event of an armed conflict or when such a conflict appears imminent, with a view to ensuring that cultural property situated within its own territory or within that of other countries is known to and respected and protected by the armed forces of the country in accordance with the provisions of the convention. And finally, C, arrange an agreement with its government for liaison and cooperation with other similar national committees and with any competent international authority. So there you've got the mandate of a national committee as envisaged by those who drew up the 1954 Hague Convention. And to me, that sounds very much like a Blue Shield national committee, although most of us aren't yet in that position, but we should be aspiring to get there. And as I say, more about that soon. Thanks very much for listening. Goodbye.